Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Anora Wang. Today's topic is, what if robots are setting my pay to employees? Economic tools to avoid compliance pitfalls. Joining me today is my co-host, Subrata Bhattacharjee. Hi, Subrata.
Hey, Anora, how are you?
Good. Would you please do the honor to introduce our guest today?
I would love to. We have today with us Rose Healy. And Rose is a director at the consulting firm Resolution Economics in Washington. And Rose provides expert consulting, litigation, and compliance support in labor and employment matters, including pay equity, federal contractor compliance, and predictive analytics. What I think is very interesting is that Rose also specializes in managing complex data, developing statistical models for impact cases, and of course talks about advising on discrimination, wage, and hour issues. And so if I want someone to tell me what robots are doing with employee pay, I think we've got the right person.
What a pleasure. Without further ado, Rose, welcome to the program.
Thank you both. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Rose, just to kick it off, not many of us are actually paying people or much less to pay people via robots. Could you please explain to the audience what algorithmic tools are being developed and used in compensation setting context?
Sure. So, we're seeing some tools being developed and marketed that promise to support the decision-making process around paying employees. So the idea is that these tools will provide fully individualized compensation recommendations based on a variety of factors such as market benchmarks, worker characteristics, and any firm-specific considerations such as budget constraints, certain geographies and roles that a company is trying to fill. So it takes a lot of that information, puts it into a tool, and essentially helps whoever the decision maker is make those decisions faster because it's based on some logic and some models behind the AI tool.
So I guess my question, if I'm following up from that, is why do businesses sort of want to use these tools? Like, what are the business goals of this type of wage setting?
Right. So, like many AI tools, the goals of these AI systems that are used to set compensation, make compensation decisions, are to create efficiencies and scale the process of the compensation setting so that, what used to take a lot of work and a lot of time to decide now can take much less time and effort. I think another area is precision, because it takes a lot of factors into consideration into the tool. What it allows businesses to do is to create a more standardized process. There's less variation and it doesn't depend on the person that's making the decision. It's instead a logic-based decision that's created for you using a model. So I think it's speed, efficiency, as well as precision. And what allows a tool to do that is, again, all of the different types of information that goes into training the tool. And one of the questions I think that comes out of that is really knowing what the data behind these tools is very important, because there are certain considerations of, well, if I'm using an AI tool from a particular vendor and a different client of that same vendor is using the same or a similar algorithm, because it's so data rich, how do I ensure that the information isn't being transferred from me to the other firm or the other way around? So I think that's probably a point of interest for maybe the audience here that might be interested in what might seem like coordination by the use of the common tool.
And out of curiosity, how many suppliers are there of these tools?
It's hard to really define because of just the variation of how it's being marketed. You're not really sure is it simply a very quick calculator, or is it actually an AI tool that keeps learning from the algorithm? So it's hard to define which of those are actually AI tools, depending on how you define it. But we've seen at least, I would say from what I've encountered, 3 or 4 big names out there that are marketing these tools. There are some smaller ones, I think, that without seeing, the back end of things, I'm not really sure if it's AI or more like it's a very quick function in Excel or something like that. And not to minimize, but.
No, but it is interesting. How widespread would you say roughly is the use of this type of tool?
Currently, I think it's a very new area where we're seeing more of these dynamic wage setting algorithms is currently in the gig economy. So, Uber food delivery apps where it depends on kind of the time of day, whether it's, raining or not, the price surge and the incentives for the drivers can differ. So those are more I think the popular ones, but in, more traditional settings where you're hiring for a bunch of engineers or, some, white collar office workers. It's less so, but it's certainly an area that's kind of becoming more popular, increasing.
So like gig economy and also sort of contractor-based workforces.
Yeah.
Interesting. So that's super helpful. My follow-up question then is, obviously we're antitrust lawyers, and we've been following what's been happening sort of around the world really for the last couple of years. So, the follow-up question is, how is AI-driven wage setting sort of fitting into the broader concerns that we all know about algorithmic pricing and coordination? Like, is this now a potential perfect storm in terms of what we're looking at?
Perfect storm, not sure, maybe not, but it certainly depends on where you sit, what types of risks you're more sensitive to. From where I sit, these AI tools are very useful. Of course, there's a lot of productivity gains and efficiencies and less guesswork when it comes to deciding how much to pay someone in this context. But it all has to be done carefully in order to lower the risks of unintended effects or potential policy violations. And from where I sit, I'm sure there are a lot of other concerns that's just outside of my expertise. But from where I sit, it's whether there's historical bias embedded into the training data that's used to create the AI model. We are all aware there are some historical, existing disparities, maybe from past mistakes, all of that. So we don't want an AI tool to be trained on data that we don't want it to replicate or worsen. And in the context of discrimination, knowing the potential historical bias in the training data is really important to kind of mitigate potential discrimination risks. So that kind of fits into the concerns around, discrimination law, whether AI is improving that or worsening that, or it has no effect. And the other concern, I think, fits into more the coordination piece that I spoke about earlier with the AI tools that are available now. Some of them that I've seen have actually advertised that, hey, we're using proprietary data for this, and it's really amazing, and it gives you very precise estimates, and it helps you get to a pay recommendation that'll for sure get someone in the door or retain someone. That's all great, and of course, more data is always better. But I think the concern there is, again, is the source of that data coming from somewhere that you as the user should be concerned about? Is it coming from a different company that has different considerations as you? Is that data individualized enough such that all of a sudden you're pretty much matching unintentionally what other companies are deciding to pay their people? So, just knowing the source and the level of detail of the data that powers this AI tool can inform whether there are or there should be any concerns of coordination behind the scenes, not arising from any type of express communication, of course, but, from the common use of a common algorithm.
And do the suppliers of the tools there's two questions. The first is, how detailed are they in explaining the underlying data that's relevant to their product? And I guess the second question I've got is like, do they compete sort of based on the quality of that data? Is sort of one sort of saying we're a superior tool than the other because our data is just better?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't seen a ton of detail, and I might understand why. There's all proprietary information that they don't want to reveal to their competitors. And I don't know if this counts as, directly kind of competing language, but, you would see some of these kind of marketing material that says, oh, we have a lot of data because we already have had clients that we've worked with and kind of different business lines of our company, and we kind of have access to those already. So there's definitely some of that language that kind of gives a potential client of theirs an idea of how much or how little data they have access to. It really varies, I would say, how vendors of these tools kind of talk about their data.
And what about granularity? Is there any some observation you've got about sort of how granular the information is that they're using?
Yeah, I think, and I can't say for sure without again seeing the back end of things, but just the way that these tools are being talked about, they say that it's going to create very individualized pay recommendations for you because it collects all of the existing pay of people that might be comparable to the position that you're trying to fill. So, you at least can get clued into the fact that, okay, not only do they have pay, but they also have what types of work these people are doing, because they can map that to the person of interest right now that's, that you're trying to set the pay for. So there's some level of detail. I don't know how deep, but that's, it's definitely a little bit more detailed than just generally this is how much people in this occupation make.
And if you're talking about sort of model outputs provided by these tools, like what dimensions do you have in terms of output? Like what could they affect?
Yeah. So definitely wage levels. You're putting into a model the characteristics of someone that's applying to your company or someone that you're trying to make market adjustments for, a current employee. And the hope is, or the goal of these tools is to be able to give you, based on those characteristics, what you should be paying that person. There are other tools, of course, that deal with other employment decisions. I think that the biggest area right now actually is hiring tools. You hear about resume screeners that kind of make the decision for you as to who to move forward to the next stage. I think those are the very popular ones in terms of AI tools that exist in the employment area. We've also seen a lot of tools that help with performance management. Some scoring tools to see how, say, call center agents are performing in their customer service tasks, some scoring algorithm that listens to their calls and, gives them some sort of score that then translates into their performance reviews and their further bonuses. So there are different AI tools that generate different metrics depending on the need of the client. Yes.
I guess as the tools get fancier, right? Like, with all these output that can be provided and in different dimensions, perhaps not just pay, also like, the trend, right? Like, how it's changing at what pace and for different category of people. Like, as fancier it gets, I think you explained before, we don't see the back end, right? Like, we meaning the people, I guess the employers who are considering or actually already using the tools, they don't see the back end. But then there is still this risk of compliance or not complying, right? So what are analytical tools that's available to people who, do not have perfect information of the backend or how that works? How can those tools help to assess the impact and possible compliance risks that's created by such AI or algorithmic tools that are used to set wages?
Yeah, that's a good question, Anora. And before I dive into the actual analytical tools, this might also be responsive to one of Subrata's earlier questions, where how do AI vendors kind of ensure their clients, or how do they talk about the data that's being used to power their tools. Some vendors actually do have their internal audits that they do. Some of them kind of do it for marketing purposes, and some of them will say, look, if you use our product, you'll be in compliance because we check it internally. And there are a few areas there that I think clients that use these tools need to think about. One is that the outputs of the AI still depend on your own input. So you get this tool that's said to been developed pretty well, no signs of any violations, but then you plug your own data in, and you might run into some issues there. So what we normally would recommend is for a client to conduct their own monitoring and conduct their own audits, even though they've had some assurance from a vendor that they've looked into this and it's all perfectly fine. And now going into the actual tools that a client can use, the first one is a bias audit. And just in very general terms, because there's a lot of detail that goes into it, bias audits are, essentially an analysis that would look at the outcomes for, the people that you've used this tool on. So let's say pay. It looks at, okay, how much is person A making? How much is person B making? And you have a whole set of people, and then you can, group them based on, let's say, their demographic characteristics. Let's say you have racial groups that you want to make comparisons across. So what a bias audit does is it looks at the results for each of those groups and then compares them and see whether there are gaps that can be attributable to the fact that AI has been used, or can you isolate those differences to, well, they're applying to different jobs. They have different skills, which can be okay. Differences are okay as long as they're, objective and they're job related. But if it turns out that it looks like it's purely based on their demographics, and that's kind of where companies that use these tools might run into issues. So bias audits are really important in that regard, where you want to make sure that your outcomes are evenly distributed across demographic groups. This is very useful in the context of anti-discrimination analyses. And then the other tool that comes to mind is an event study on wage levels. So if you're using a tool and then you implement AI and somehow you're seeing a decline in wages, and that might be a problem, might not be a problem, depending on the larger context, right? If there are broader, economic conditions that would actually explain this, the supply and demand for labor might, cause the price of labor to go down, that might be fine. But if it's due solely to the implementation of AI, and we know, or we think, or maybe there's concerns about what the AI is using as its source data, whether that's from a different company, or if it pulls from pay information that's not really related to your own workforce, then that will kind of generate some questions as to is this AI tool causing wages to go down or slowing the wage growth in a way that we didn't expect, given everything else that's happening in the broader context. So those are the two. I think the most important, maybe one of the most important points here is to always just also remember that there's no one size fits all analysis. There can be different and other tools that need to be employed outside of bias audits and event studies. And it all depends on the context, as well as the available data. We keep talking about, we wish we could see the back end so we know exactly how to work on, these questions, but it's very case by case, depends on the context and the available data. So there are, I'm sure, plenty of other tools out there that might fit those other situations.
Yeah, I think when we talk about compliance in this particular context, or we're talking about compliance with not just the pay, I guess, whatever, laws, states, federal, or wherever you live, right? The laws that exist to prevent a certain type of discrimination. And then there are compliance with antitrust laws, right? And Subrata, I think you asked a question about granularity, things like that. That's so much going to the antitrust risk. But here it sounds like the tools that you have described are more geared towards at least preventing some of the compliance risk with the pay discrimination, right? So with the bias audits, if perhaps you can give us some examples on especially if you can shed light on what the challenges that might be existing and in deploying these bias audits.
Sure. Actually, in New York City, there's a local law that provides specifics on one type of bias audit that can be used. And this is all in the context of hiring, by the way. So this is a little bit outside of what we're currently talking about, but it at least gives you an idea of an easy tool that one can use to have a starting point. Just look at whether there are any difference in particular in particular groups or particular areas within their workforce. So what that law requires actually is publishing these bias audits. And what these bias audits shows are simple impact ratios is what we call them, which is essentially looking at the selection rate for one group versus the selection rate for another group, and then comparing that, and that's it. And the advantage of that approach is it's quick and dirty test. It's easy to implement. It gives you a pretty good starting point of where to dig deeper. But a known disadvantage of that approach is that it only looks at the selection rate. You're not really accounting for anything that really might have gone into the decision. When you're thinking about hiring, you're wanting to look at experience, education level, and all of that, and impact ratios don't necessarily take that into account. So another approach that actually takes more information and provides kind of more detailed insights is a bias audit that uses a regression analysis. And what a regression analysis does, hopefully in simple terms, is it takes the output and as well as the job-related predictors of that output. So for pay, it would be, again, skills, maybe any special certifications, anything that is objective and is considered by a company in paying their people. So a regression analysis takes all of that and isolates the effect of the workers' demographics and measures whether there's statistical significance. So it's a more complete analysis, I would say, is the advantage of it. But the disadvantage is that it does require a certain level of knowledge, technical knowledge to implement, as well as data availability, which we keep talking about. It depends on how much data you have. If you don't have it, then you just can't analyze it in a more complete manner.
I think one other tool that you talked a little more about is the event studies. I guess this is just my very shallow understanding. Is basically the bias audits is more helping you to tell whether you're discriminating, right? Not so much on whether you have colluded with your competitors in discriminating. And now this other tool that you're talking about, which is event study, you actually focus a little bit more on the latter, right? Whether you're sort of having some sort of impact on the labor market. Can you tell us a little bit more about the event studies and how it's evaluating or assessing the impact of the particular pay decision in terms of vis-a-vis the labor market?
Sure. So event studies, just in general, again, it looks at the impact of a particular event on something that you're interested in. And in this case, it would be wage levels, right? So this is pretty common in cases where, there's an event, for example, a merger. Let's set aside the AI for now, but let's say there's a merger, and you want to see whether there's an impact not only on the product market but also on the labor market. So you want to see whether this merger actually drove down the wages for employees of the two entities that are merging. And what's nice about event studies is it accounts for random fluctuations, because you don't there's always going to be some differences from one time period to the next, and that could be explained by a variety of things that's outside of the event itself. So an event study then isolates those factors and then accounts for them so that you can see how much of this difference is actually driven by the policy change or by the merger or by the event. And so in the context of wage setting, the event and wage setting with AI, the event in question can be AI implementation instead of a merger. So, it asks the question, if I implement this AI today, will I see in the future, wage going down? And, is that driven by, just the broader economic conditions, or is that because of my use of the AI, which might have been influenced or powered by data that I wasn't expecting? So, that's kind of how from there, then you can work backwards. If you do see some sort of drop, then you can kind of raise more questions and see where that source might be coming from.
Can I shift gears a bit here? So we've talked a bit sort of about how the products are implemented and how you can sort of audit what the output is. I guess my question is maybe on the other side of that, which is how has the use of these tools been sort of dealt with in terms of litigation or investigation risk?
Yeah, so both of these techniques are known and widely accepted, and they use econometric tools that are accepted by the courts as pretty good evidence that something may or may not have harmed the relevant labor market. For bias audits, I would say the local law in New York, for example, that I mentioned earlier, it requires bias audit results to be published. And so what that leads to is that adverse parties can look at that published result and, raise questions and prompt potential investigations. And what we've seen is, employers or companies that are being asked these questions and are being threatened some investigations. What's worked for them is doing their own internal bias audits that kind of account for more information beyond what's being published. Because I think I described earlier what's required to be published are simple, pretty much averages is how I would think of it. It doesn't really account for the nuances of the actual process. So it's been effective for companies to kind of do a more detailed analysis on their end, either proactively. I think I would say that's probably the better way, or reactively. If they do get these questions, then they can go in, dive deeper, do a pretty comprehensive bias audit, and be able to demonstrate that, look, these impact ratios, they can be informative, but they don't tell you the bigger picture.
I mean, my sense from you is that the way you're describing this is that really a business that's implementing the tool, would not necessarily be well served just by using it as a turnkey kind of solution. That what you're saying is that on top of that, there's a degree of verification that company would probably need to do to totally manage the risk of using the product. Absolutely,
and those proactive audits are really important, I would say, because I could think of kind of three reasons, right? What is the regulation asking you to do? Are you being asked to publish? What types of metrics are you being asked to publish? And so you would, need an audit that fits that. But then also, let's say, you're using a tool and having a big hiring push or wanting to do market adjustments for a big population of your workforce. You want to monitor it closely when you're doing that because just of the range and the heavy impact that might have on your workforce if you're doing kind of a big push like that. And, third, and I think what's known about AI tools is that if you don't monitor them closely, there's a tendency of drift, model drift, which really what that is the more you use an AI tool and the more that it learns from data that's being output and the data that's being input, there might be a tendency that it moves farther and farther away from its original intent, from the training data. So you want to monitor it closely so that you can make adjustments and refinements as needed if you start getting some unexpected results, some hallucinations, all of that. You want to have at least some periodic checkpoints to make sure that doesn't occur.
So look, one of the nice things about, frankly, this podcast and your presentation is that it sort of takes our audience to a cutting edge or new area that we might not have really been aware of. I guess one question that the average Curious Amalgam listener would likely have is, keeping in mind relatively recent sort of use of these tools, is there sort of academic sort of study that's notable that sort of explores kind of these issues a bit further?
Yeah, so I'm glad you phrased that question and, reminding the audience that this is still fairly new because, I think further research still needs to be done on AI and specifically on its use in setting compensation outside of the gig economy that's already been around for a while, the dynamic real-time pricing that's already been well documented. But for workforces outside of that, I would say this is fairly new, like I said earlier, that I've seen a handful of vendors that are advertising this or selling this kind of tool. But I think it's going to grow pretty quickly because there's really a lot of benefit that you could get from these tools if you implement it correctly. Outside of that, there are many studies that document other relevant concepts that apply here, such as the event and policy impacts on wages. You could see maybe minimum wage changes or a particular company's change in pay policies. It's well documented that you can use these analytical tools to study the impact of those policies and whether there are differences in certain parts of the workforce. For example, studies on hospitals or hospital systems have documented that there might be some wage penalties arising from, acquisition strategies that might impact, nurses more than the non-nursing occupations within those hospitals. So those studies also inform the strategy and the analysis of, well, sure, let's look at it, from a broader standpoint, but let's also make sure we're providing context of where these potential problems are really coming from, or there's certain sections. And there are also studies around dynamic pricing, like I mentioned earlier, within the gig economy, and how some dynamic pricing models affect, gender disparities. For example, some rideshare companies can employ dynamic pricing based on, customer demand, but also based on driver profiles, trying to reward certain drivers, maybe those that have more flexible schedules, maybe those that work longer hours. And we know that those factors tend to be correlated with things like gender. And so there's been studies around, how to potentially correct for that, and, different proposals of, maybe if you tweak this a little bit, then that might solve that problem. But again, just on the specific case that we're talking about here, I'd say it's fairly new. If any of the listeners have actually encountered academic studies, I'd be happy to hear them because I haven't seen any.
Great.
Well, thank you, Rose. Obviously, this is a evolving area that's so fast. It's almost hard to imagine that we can actually look ahead. But if you are actually asked to look ahead and make some predictions, would you think there are certain areas or certain aspects of the whole analysis that we have talked about that's becoming a little bit more or less difficult as the technologies evolve?
I think it's going to be more difficult. Well, maybe less as we kind of develop our analytical toolbox more. But I think more difficult in terms of the the advancement, I would say the current challenges that we already have is this so-called black box of these AI systems. And, returning again to this idea of I wish I could just see everything that's on the back end so I know exactly how to model my analysis and how to set it up. But what we're having to do now is, working backwards. So looking at the output, seeing if there are any differences there or potential problems, and then taking those step by step, asking kind of the questions that come out of those issues, and then hopefully the responses to those questions kind of clue you into, what really is this model doing that that generates that kind of output. And related to that, I think the development and the in the field of AI agents, I think is going to introduce a lot of questions and a lot of challenges, and that's because current AI systems that are used for automation are more task oriented, and AI agents are intended to be more goal oriented. And what that means is there's no start and end. This is what this tool is doing. I know exactly what the input is, or supposedly what the input is and what the output is. Now, with the introduction of agentic AI, where you give them a somewhat vague prompt, and then it takes a process from start to finish, and is able to pivot and make decisions without human input or very minimal human input. These pivots and these decisions and the adaptability of an agent can introduce a problem for an analyst. If I'm looking at an AI tool or an AI agent, it's going to be difficult to know where exactly to start. Where was the problem introduced in the first place? How did this AI agent make this decision of pivoting to one approach versus another? And so there's just kind of a branching out of issues there, and just knowing where to start, I think is going to be more difficult with agents. And then lastly, I think the evolving regulation. All of these tools are developing pretty fast. I know regulation, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, is also trying to catch up. But from an analyst's perspective, a lot of our analyses are informed by the laws. Like what really is the central question here? And so we also kind of need to catch up on the regulation to make sure that our analyses are framed well and are informative and offer insights as to whether there are any violations that's happening or not.
Well, thank you, Rose. This has been a great, informative and also thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for bringing all those new information and suggestions for future directions to look at. Now, before we let you go, we usually take this opportunity on this podcast to let our audience to learn a little bit more about you as a person, rather than just the professional life that you lead. So if you could share us just one thing about you that people might not know if they have only worked with you professionally, what would that one thing be?
That one thing would be that I was never going to be an economist. when I was first deciding what I was going to do, I actually started out studying journalism and broadcast communication. I used to envision myself being a broadcaster. I don't know if I really want to do that anymore. I'm happy to be here in this podcast with you all, but in front of a camera and all of that isn't really my interest anymore, I would say. But that was my past life, journalism.
Glad that we have contributed a little bit, but just towards fulfilling your other dreams. Thank you for sharing all the information and all the learnings on the subject matter.
Yes,
and thank you, Subrata, for being a wonderful co-host. And thank you, audience, for listening and watching. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.